Welcome students. Today we are going to discuss with respect to the program for LLB degree and BA LLB for the subject of administrative law on the semesters 3 and 7, and the paper code is ADL0313 or ADL0713. Today the topic for discussion is being there under Unit 2, which speaks about delegated legislation, and the module name is Development of Delegated Legislation under module number 5. Myself, Afshan B, Assistant Professor at GR Kare College of Law, Margaon, Goa. The outline of the topic is that it is going to be discussed, or we will be discussing the concept of delegated legislation, the factors leading to the growth of delegated legislation, and delegated legislation in USA and in India. The learning outcomes as to why do we need to study the concept of delegated legislation. Here, the student will be able to understand the evolving concept of delegated legislation, the changes, the challenges to the administrative framework while applying the principle of delegated legislation, to know the reasons with respect to the growth of delegated legislation, and finally, the student will have an overview with respect to the application of delegated legislation in the USA and in India. So to begin with, to know the concept of delegated legislation, we will look into the definition and meaning of the concept of delegated legislation. Delegated legislation is an expression which covers a multitude of confusions. It is an excuse for the legislators, a shield for the administrators, and a provocation to the constitutional jurists. According to the Committee on Ministers' Powers, the expression is used in the means of the exercising of the power of the rule-making delegated to the executive by the legislature, and it means the output of the exercise of the power. So generally, delegated legislation means the law made by the executive under the powers delegated by the legislature. So we will understand as to what is delegated legislation is when the function of the legislation is entrusted to the organs other than the legislature itself. The legislation made by such organs is called as that of the delegated legislation. So knowing into as to what is delegated legislation, we will also need to know as to what are the various reasons for the growth of delegated legislation. So here there are certain reasons or the growth or the various characteristic features as to why there is increase in the delegated legislation. First and foremost, there is pressure upon the parliamentary time. The truth is that if the parliament were not willing to delegate the lawmaking powers, the parliament would not be able to pass any kind of quality legislation with respect to the modern public opinion requires. So as this pressure has to be lowered down, there is delegation of the powers from the parliament to the executive. Secondly, the technicality of it. The subject matter many a times which is being allotted to the legislation is of a technical nature, which requires a lot of consultations of the experts. So this can be done only by the executive. So for that reason, there is an increase in the growth of delegated legislation. Thirdly, flexibility. Parliament does not function continuously. It may be functioning in once or 3 months or once in a year, wherein it is not possible to carry out the amendments again and again due to the contingencies and due to the changes which is being carried out in the society. So for that reason, we have the delegations of the powers which is given to the executive, which helps in the flexibility with respect to the making of the rules and the regulations. Nextly, there is experimentation which can be done by the executive. That is, once a law is being made by the legislature, it cannot be experimented, but it is being implemented. But when a rule or a regulation, if it is being made by the executive or made by the administration, there can very well be experimentations which can be done, wherein there can be removal of it, there can be cancellations of it. So here there is a utilization of the principles of experimentations on the basis of the experiences and the implementations as and when it is being required for the necessary changes. Next reason for the growth of it is that of emergencies. In the time of the emergencies, it is not possible to knock at the doors of the legislature or the parliament to make the laws. So at that point of time, we have the instant laws which are the rules which is being made by the executives. Here, in times of emergencies, there has to be a quick action which has to be taken. And this quick action can be taken only by the executive in certain cases where there is delegation of legislation, which is the only convenient remedy available. Confidential matters is the next reason as to why there is an increase in the growth of delegated legislation. Sometimes or in some situations, there are certain public interest demands which is being there, which is of a confidential nature. And in this confidential natures, there can be certain rules or regulations which could be made. Next is the complexity of the modern administration. It is very difficult to understand the modern administration. So the responsibility of the state is totally related to welfarism. But most of the time, the legislation does not take into consideration the welfare principle. So it is the executive or the administration who actually looks into the complexity of the modern administration or the modern contingencies which is being carried out. Now looking into the reasons or the growths which is being there, or looking into the principles as to why there is a growth in the looking of the principle of delegated legislations, we will look into the principle as to how it is being applied in the USA and what is the position of delegated legislation in India. So we will take into consideration firstly the principle as applied in USA. In the USA, the principle applied here is not strictly with respect to that of delegated legislation. What do they follow is the principle of separation of powers, wherein there is three organs separately being functioning, that is the legislative, executive and the judiciary. There is no strict overlapping of the principle which is being there, and there is no much delegation in practice. But in certain cases, there is an applicability with respect to the principle of delegated legislation. Secondly, the powers thus are delegated but not legislative powers. The overall functioning of the lawmaking is given in the hands of the legislature, and there is no overlapping of the functions which is being made. So if you take into consideration as a study with respect to USA, the delegated legislation principle is not at that height as compared to that of the other states. The application of it is rare or is less if you take into consideration the application of it in the other states. Now looking into the position of it in the USA, we also need to know as to what is the position of the delegated legislation in India. During the pre-constitutional period, the first case which discussed about delegated legislation is that of Queen versus Burra, that is in the year 1878. It is the leading principle or the leading case which considered the propounding doctrine of the conditional legislation, wherein there was the principle which was being followed with respect to that of the delegated legislation. Recently, in the case of Reed-Delhi Laws Act, also the popularly known as the Reed-Delhi case, says that the essential legislative functions cannot be delegated, whereas the non-essential functions can be delegated. So we will look into this particular principles when we discuss about the topic about the restraints and the judicial control, wherein there is a bar as to when there can be a rule or when there can be a making of a rule or when there can be no making of a rule. So here, with respect to the understanding in the principles of in India, we know that there is an applicability of the delegated legislation, looking into the reasons as to the growth of it and understanding that we require it in today's modern times. These are the references which is being made with respect to the topic on the development of delegated legislations for your ready reference. Thank you.